when a small, pale-faced boy steps onto a creaking wooden dock in a remote coastal village. He only wants a quiet summer. But as he spies a strange flicker of light high up in an abandoned lighthouse, a place everyone insists is deserted, he becomes certain that something is terribly wrong in this age-worn community. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in the power of uncovering the truth, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Rowan's very first impression of the village is one of isolation and slow decay. The bus that brought him has already rumbled away, leaving him standing on the uneven dock with the tang of salt in the air and an eerie hush all around. He can see the silhouettes of fishing cottages lining the dirt road that winds away from the harbor, roofs sagging under age and seagull droppings. The wind rattles loose shutters, occasionally bringing the sharp cry of a seabird. No modern cars crowd the streets. Instead, a single battered truck is parked near a small building that might be the post office. Everything about this place feels like it was locked in a time capsule decades ago. Rowan's aunt and uncle, Aunt Mabel and Uncle Albert, appear in the distance, waving from where they stand by the single-lane road that leads up the hill. They're both in their 60s, but they move with a brisk energy that belies their years. Aunt Mabel wears a long wool coat, despite the season, while Uncle Albert hunches a bit in the wind, his cap pulled low. They seem relieved to see Rowan, though caution and worry line their faces. Rowan shoulders a small bag of belongings, hoisting it with some effort. He's 12 years old but slender enough to seem even younger, with hair that curls around his ears and skin so fair that his cheeks flush easily from the slightest breeze. He quietly approaches his aunt and uncle, and they fold him into warm if slightly awkward hugs. "Rowan, dear, you must be tired from the journey," Aunt Mabel says, smoothing his hair. "We'd have met you at the bigger bus station, but the roads here can be unpredictable." "It's fine," Rowan replies softly. He looks down the deserted dock. "Not many people around?" "Locals keep to themselves," Uncle Albert says, exchanging a glance with his wife. "Though they'll warm up to you soon enough. Let's get you settled in." They walk up the slope, Rowan lagging slightly to catch his breath. His lungs ache in the cool, damp air, but a part of him finds the environment strangely invigorating. The shriek of gulls and the distant roar of waves pounding against rocks fill his ears, and a briny taste settles on his lips. He's here because of his health, an ongoing respiratory issue that's never been fully diagnosed. His parents, who are currently traveling abroad for work, believe the sea air might bolster his condition, and so they've entrusted him to Aunt Mabel and Uncle Albert for the summer. The couple's cottage sits halfway up a gentle cliff path, perched above the ocean like a silent sentinel. It's a modest two-story building with whitewashed walls and a narrow porch. The paint has started peeling along the window frames, and the roof sags in places, but it has a well-maintained garden full of herbs and sea grasses. The moment he steps inside, Rowan notices the distinct smell of lavender and old books. The front room is cozy, with a worn rug that's been meticulously patched in several places. Family photos line the mantel above a small fireplace, and a crocheted blanket drapes over a faded armchair in the corner. "Your room is just up the stairs," Aunt Mabel says. She smiles, though there's a ghost of sadness in her eyes that Rowan can't help noticing. "We've got fresh sheets on the bed and plenty of blankets. The nights can get chilly." Rowan thanks her, mounting the narrow wooden staircase that leads to the upper floor. As he passes a closed door at the end of the hall, he feels a faint chill. Something about that door tugs at his attention. Its frame is chipped, and there's a small flower carving near the doorknob. He wonders if it was a child's room once. A flicker of curiosity flares in him, but he's exhausted from the trip, so he continues to the room prepared for him, placing his bag on a neatly made bed. An antique oil lamp stands on the bedside table, though there's also a small modern lamp near the window. The house seems poised between old-fashioned tradition and modern convenience, a reflection of Aunt Mabel and Uncle Albert themselves. That evening, Aunt Mabel cooks a hearty fish stew for dinner, the aroma filling the kitchen with warmth. Uncle Albert sits at the small table, carefully reading the day's newspaper. Rowan notices the date on the paper is at least a few days old. News seems slow to reach this part of the world. The conversation over dinner remains light, mostly about Rowan's trip and how the sea might help him recover. Though the meal is pleasant, Rowan picks up an undercurrent of tension whenever Aunt Mabel glances at him, and he can't shake the feeling that she's silently comparing him to someone else. The thought nags at him, but he's too polite to bring it up. After dinner, the sun sets, casting a golden glow over the water. The family moves into the living room, with Uncle Albert puffing on a pipe, something Rowan's not sure is good for his own lungs, but the man's mindful enough to step outside when it becomes too smoky. Aunt Mabel tidies up, humming quietly, her voice laced with wistfulness. Rowan goes to the window, looking out across the ocean. Although the sky is darkening, he notices a tall silhouette on a distant headland, the lighthouse. Its shape is commanding, even though he's been told it's been abandoned for years. Something about it sends a curious shiver down Rowan's spine. He stares at it for a few minutes, seeing nothing but darkness. Then, right as he's about to look away, a faint glow appears at the very top. He blinks. It's gone as quickly as it came, but he's certain he saw something. Or is his mind playing tricks on him? He decides to mention it. Aunt Mabel, do people ever go up to the lighthouse? She stiffens, and Uncle Albert stops rifling through his paper. They exchange a look. Not that I'm aware, Aunt Mabel says, frowning. That place has been abandoned for as long as I can remember. I thought I saw a light, Rowan says softly, now unsure of himself. Uncle Albert shakes his head. Probably just the moon reflecting on the windows, he says. It happens sometimes. The glass up there hasn't been replaced in ages. Aunt Mabel's face remains tense, though she forces a smile. Anyway, you should stay away from that area, Rowan. The cliff path there is dangerous, and the building itself might collapse. Promise me you won't wander too far. Rowan nods slowly. He senses his aunt's concern is genuine, yet there's also a strange intensity in her eyes, almost like fear. The subject is closed after that, and they retire for the night. Rowan lies in bed, listening to the wind outside. He can almost hear the crash of waves at the base of the cliffs. His lungs ache with each breath, but the salty air also feels soothing in a way. He wonders about that brief glimmer of light he saw. Could it really have been a reflection? Or something else? Sleep eventually overtakes him, and he dreams of dusty corridors winding up through a lighthouse, each door locked, each step echoing with the distant cries of someone unseen. When he wakes at dawn, his heart is pounding, and a chill sweat coats his brow. His first day in the village begins with Aunt Mabel showing him around. The morning fog lies thick over the dirt roads, and their boots leave imprints in the damp ground. They pass a small bakery, which is just opening. The door creaks, releasing a warm, yeasty smell into the chilly air. The baker, an old woman named Hester, greets them with a nod and a small loaf in hand. You must be the new boy, Hester says in a kindly tone, though her eyes are sharp. Rowan, is it? Rowan smiles politely. Yes, ma'am. I'm staying with my aunt and uncle for the summer. Hester's gaze flickers briefly, and Rowan senses a question there. Well, you eat up, she says, pressing the loaf into Aunt Mabel's hands. That'll put some color in your cheeks. They move on, and Rowan notices how deserted the main street is. A couple of fishermen trudge toward the docks, carrying nets over their shoulders. A single shop stands near a bend in the road, its sign reading simply General Store. Aunt Mabel leads Rowan inside, greeting the shopkeeper, Harriet. She's a tall, serious-faced woman in her 70s, dressed in a worn sweater and skirt. I'm just picking up the usual, Harriet, Aunt Mabel says, handing over a small list. And this is Rowan, my nephew? Harriet nods politely, her lined face relaxing a bit. I heard you arrived yesterday. Hope you settle in. Then, almost casually, Harriet looks at him with something close to pity. The sea does wonders for many ailments. It's helped folks here for generations. Rowan tries to return her smile, but he's caught off guard by how Harriet's expression darkens the moment Aunt Mabel's back is turned. There's something unspoken in the shopkeeper's gaze, like a secret she prefers to keep sealed. Rowan feels goosebumps rise on his arms, and he's not sure why. They purchase a few staples, including tinned fish, tea, and flour. Before they leave, Rowan musters the courage to ask, "Does anyone still visit the lighthouse?" Harriet's response is instant, and her voice is sharp. "Oh, it's out of service. Has been for decades." Her reaction startles him. He offers a quick nod. "That's what I've heard." Aunt Mabel gives him a nudge, guiding him away before any further questions can emerge. The air outside the shop feels colder now, and Rowan's curiosity only grows. He's determined to understand why the lighthouse is such a taboo subject. They continue their rounds, dropping off letters at the tiny post office, really just a desk inside another building, and saying quick hellos to a few neighbors. Rowan picks up on a pattern. The townspeople are polite but guarded, especially around a newcomer. Their gazes often dart away when he meets their eyes, as if they're afraid to let him see what they're thinking. After a quiet lunch back at the cottage, Rowan convinces Aunt Mabel and Uncle Albert to let him walk alone around the village, promising to stay away from the cliff path. They eventually agree, with many reminders to be cautious. Rowan sets off, half excited and half nervous. He ambles along the rutted roads, pausing now and then to breathe in the salty air. A battered rowboat is pulled up on the shore, rusted chains trailing from its stern. Gulls circle overhead. He eventually spots an elderly man sitting on a porch, sipping tea from a chipped mug. The man, whom Rowan later learns is named Malcolm, gives him a considering look. Rowan returns the greeting with a friendly nod. "Afternoon, sir," Rowan says. "I'm just exploring the village." Malcolm sips his tea. "You're Mabel's nephew, aren't you?" he rasps, voice rough from years of salty wind. "She mentioned you'd be around." Rowan steps closer. "Yes, sir. I'm Rowan. I'll be here all summer." Malcolm's eyes flick to the horizon, where the silhouette of the lighthouse is just visible. "You best be careful around here. This place, well, it might look quiet, but old wounds run deep." Rowan is instantly intrigued. "What do you mean?" He expects Malcolm to clam up the way others have, but the old man surprises him. He sets down his mug. "We used to have children from all over come here. They said the sea air was good for them, especially if they had weak lungs or other ailments. Families believed in it. A local doctor set up a kind of clinic in that lighthouse, of all places." Rowan leans forward. "A clinic in the lighthouse? How long ago?" Malcolm's weathered face creases in thought. 50 years, maybe more. Hard to recall. I was just a boy myself, but I remember it because of the strange hush that fell on the town whenever the subject was raised. Especially after some of those children never came back. A chill runs through Rowan. They disappeared? Malcolm taps the side of his mug. The official word was that they got transferred to a larger hospital somewhere else. Better care. But no one got the proper records, from what I heard. Families wrote letters, asked questions, got excuses, half-truths. He sighs heavily. Many gave up. Too expensive to keep traveling out here, looking for answers. It was another era, boy. People had fewer means, less communication. If you were told your child needed specialized care and that the doctor had arranged transport, you had to trust it. Rowan shivers. "So, no one knows what really happened?" The old man grimaces. "Some folks claim it's all rumor. Others, like me, well, we suspect something more sinister. But life went on, and the older generation wanted to forget. Some of them, I reckon, knew more than they let on." Rowan feels a queasiness in his stomach. He senses that Malcolm has already revealed more than he meant to. Just then, the old man picks up his mug again, focusing on his tea as though the conversation is done. Rowan thanks him and continues his walk, his thoughts in turmoil. When Rowan returns to the cottage that evening, Aunt Mabel asks about his day, but he can't bring himself to mention Malcolm's revelations. He senses the topic is too charged, and he's not sure how she'd react. Instead, he mumbles about how friendly the townspeople are, how quiet the streets remain. Aunt Mabel nods, relief flickering in her eyes, as if glad the conversation stays mundane. That night, Rowan has trouble sleeping. The wind picks up, rattling the window panes. Occasionally, he coughs, but the spasms are less severe than they would have been in the city. He puts a hand to his chest, feeling his heart beat. The sea air might be doing him some good, or maybe it's just the novelty of being away from the pollution of buses and cars. Still, his mind returns to Malcolm's words, echoing again and again. Children used to be taken up there. Some never came back. He tosses and turns, eventually slipping into a restless sleep. In his dreams, he sees flickering lights from high above, hears the echo of footsteps in a spiral stairwell, and feels the presence of someone, reaching out in the darkness. The next morning brings low-hanging clouds and a damp chill. Uncle Albert needs to fix a broken fence post in the yard, and Rowan offers to help. He hammers nails under his uncle's guidance, feeling a small surge of pride whenever he manages to drive a nail in straight. Aunt Mabel watches from the doorway, her expression veiled. She thanks Rowan for helping, and as he wipes sweat from his brow, he notices her casting an occasional glance toward the horizon where the lighthouse stands. In the afternoon, Rowan is sent to fetch some quilt scraps from the attic, a task he's oddly enthusiastic about, because it gives him a chance to explore the older parts of the house. Aunt Mabel tells him to be careful on the rickety stairs and to bring down only the small trunk that holds the leftover quilt squares. The attic is dimly lit by a single dusty window. Cobwebs drape across exposed rafters. Rowan cautiously navigates the creaking floorboards until he finds a chest that looks promising. When he opens it, he sees bits of fabric in various colors and patterns, just as Aunt Mabel described. But as he lifts them out, a photograph slips free from between two pieces of cloth and flutters to the ground. He kneels and picks it up. The photo is faded with age, the edges yellowed, but Rowan can make out a group of children standing in front of the lighthouse. Their clothes look decades old, high socks, buttoned shirts, and old-fashioned dresses. There's an adult at the edge of the group, wearing what appears to be a white medical coat. The man is tall, with a severe expression, and something about his stance radiates authority. On the back of the photo, written in spidery handwriting, is a date from decades ago, along with two words, Clinic Day. Rowan feels a surge of adrenaline. This is concrete evidence of something that the villagers claim has been forgotten or dismissed. He rushes downstairs to show Aunt Mabel, ignoring the dust on his clothes. When she sees the photograph, her face pales. Her lips part as though she wants to speak, but no words come out at first. Uncle Albert peers over her shoulder, his eyes darkening. Finally, Aunt Mabel clears her throat. "Where did you find this?" "In the chest with the quilt scraps," Rowan says, heart pounding. "I thought, maybe you could tell me more about it?" Aunt Mabel runs her thumb gently over the photo. "I was just a girl myself," she says, her voice trembling. "I barely remember the details, just that a doctor came to run a small clinic out of the lighthouse. People said he had innovative treatments for children with lung troubles, like you. My parents believed in it, everyone did. We were told the sea air had special properties, and that this doctor had a way of harnessing them." She takes a shaky breath. "But then, some children didn't come home." Uncle Albert puts a hand on her shoulder. "That was so long ago, Mabel. We don't need to reopen old wounds." But Aunt Mabel can't tear her gaze from the photograph. Her eyes are wet with tears. "We lost our own child years ago," she says to Rowan, her voice thick with grief. "It was after the clinic had already closed, but the memory of it all, of losing children in this town, it weighs heavily." Rowan's throat tightens. "I'm sorry," he whispers, unsure what else to say. Aunt Mabel sniffles and hands him the photo. "Keep it if you want," she says, surprising him. It's too painful for me." Rowan nods, tucking the photo gently into his pocket. He sees Uncle Albert's expression, a mixture of sadness and resentment, as if he blames the past for the sorrow that still lingers in this house. From that moment on, Rowan's curiosity evolves into a quiet determination. He can't just let this go, especially now that he's seen the evidence. That evening, after dinner, he slips outside under the pretense of taking a walk. The sky is overcast, the horizon a haze of dark clouds. He follows the winding road toward the edge of the village, where he knows the cliff path leads to the lighthouse. There's no direct sign pointing the way, just a narrow track flanked by stunted pines, their branches warped by relentless wind. As he draws nearer, the roar of the waves below becomes thunderous. The path is steep, and he can see the ocean churning angrily against the rocks far below. The wind buffets him, threatening to unbalance him. He stumbles several times, pressing onward, heart pounding. Eventually, a dilapidated wooden fence appears, with weather-faded signs reading, "Keep out" and "Danger" in bold letters. The ground beyond looks uneven, overgrown with thorns and wild grass. But Rowan is too determined to heed the warnings. He inches around the fence, feeling the wet grass cling to his shoes. He catches his first close-up view of the lighthouse, tall, cylindrical, its stone walls cracked from decades of exposure to storms. Seaweed clings to the base where the waves sometimes splash high during storms. The metal railing around the top platform is rusted, parts of it missing. Despite the gloom, Rowan sees a faint glimmer again at the highest window. His pulse accelerates. It can't just be a reflection. He approaches carefully, the wooden door looming ahead. It's solidly built, with iron rivets and hinges that look older than any he's seen before. Suddenly, there's a shifting sound from within, like footsteps or shuffling. Before Rowan can decide what to do, the door creaks open just enough for a figure to peer out. In the dusk, Rowan sees a lined face and sharp eyes. "What are you doing here?" the man demands, his voice rough and urgent. This is no place for children. Rowan nearly loses his footing. "I'm sorry," he stammers. "I saw a light. I just wanted to see who was here." The man steps out, revealing himself to be in his late 60s, with unkempt gray hair and a face etched with weariness. He's dressed in a threadbare sweater and trousers stiff with salt and dust. "You'll catch your death in this wind," he growls, though there's a hint of concern beneath his brusque tone. Without waiting for a reply, he jerks his head toward the door. "Get inside before you're blown off the cliff." Rowan hesitates, then slips inside the lighthouse. Immediately, a musty smell envelopes him, damp stone, rotting wood, and the faint metallic tang of rust. A single lantern sits on a rickety table, casting a dim, flickering light. Rowan sees that the interior is cluttered with old chairs, broken crates, and stacks of dusty books. A spiral staircase winds upward along the wall, disappearing into the darkness. "Are you the keeper?" Rowan asks, glancing at the man. He snorts. "No keeper here," he says. "Hasn't been one in decades. Name's Alden. I just stay here." "But I saw a light," Rowan presses. Alden's gaze flicks to the lantern. "I keep a small flame burning," he says. "Helps keep the place from feeling too empty." He scans Rowan's face. "You're not from here, are you?" "No," Rowan admits. "I'm staying with my aunt and uncle, Mabel and Albert." Alden flinches at the mention of their names. "So you're that boy," he mutters, turning away. "You shouldn't be here. This building is falling apart. Next storm could bring half of it down." Rowan moves to say something else, but he notices a table in a far corner covered with what appear to be old documents. Some are photographs, others are letters with strange symbols and medical terms. Before he can get a closer look, Alden steps between him and the table, his eyes wide with alarm. "Go on, get out," Alden snaps, though his voice shakes. "You have no business meddling in things you don't understand." Rowan's heart thumps. He's certain those documents are connected to the lighthouse's past. Are those records of the old clinic?" Alden's lips tighten. He seems on the verge of telling Rowan to leave again, but instead he pinches the bridge of his nose. "You should go home," he says, forcibly steadying his voice. "Do as your aunt and uncle tell you. This place isn't for you." In that moment, Rowan hears something that could be dripping water, or perhaps footsteps coming from above. It's impossible to tell. The hair on the back of his neck stands up. He has so many questions, yet Alden's agitation warns him that pushing might make things worse. With one last glance at the table, he quietly turns and slips out the door. The wind lashes at him as he steps onto the cliff path. He looks back once, seeing Alden in the doorway, the lantern's glow behind him turning his silhouette into an ominous shape. Then the door slams shut, and Rowan is alone in the gloom. The trek back to the cottage is harder, partly due to fatigue and partly because his mind is racing with possibilities. He recalls the photograph in his pocket, the talk of a doctor who specialized in curing children. The documents he glimpsed in the lighthouse might hold the key to understanding it all. When Rowan tells Aunt Mabel about Alden, her face goes ashen. She sets down her teacup with trembling hands. "Alden," she repeats. "I recall that name. He was once an assistant to the doctor who ran that so-called clinic." Uncle Albert frowns deeply. "They say he vanished after the doctor left. Some folks assumed he moved away or, I don't know. But apparently he never really left the lighthouse." Aunt Mabel stands abruptly, her eyes filled with alarm. "Rowan, you must promise me you won't go near that place again. If Alden is really there, I don't trust him. He was part of something terrible." Rowan looks down. "But maybe he knows what happened," he says quietly. "He might have answers." She shakes her head. "Some things are best left in the past." The conversation ends with a tense silence. Rowan feels a pang of guilt for worrying Aunt Mabel, but also a surge of defiance. The next day, he wanders through the village again, searching for someone who might be more open to discussing the old clinic. But everyone he talks to clams up the moment he mentions the lighthouse. Some offer vague dismissals. Others warn him to focus on his own well-being instead of stirring up old ghosts. As the days pass, Rowan's frustration grows. He sees faint lights from the lighthouse each night, sometimes just a flicker, other times a steadier glow. Alden clearly maintains some presence there. Is it a ritual? A memorial of sorts? The puzzle gnaws at Rowan, especially after Aunt Mabel confides a piece of her own tragedy. She lost her daughter many years ago to a sudden fever. The doctor had already left by then, but the unspoken fear is that the child's death was somehow tied to the same undercurrent of secrecy in the town. One afternoon, Rowan crosses paths with Malcolm again. The old man sits on his porch as usual, sipping tea and staring out at the horizon. Gathering his courage, Rowan approaches. "I met Alden," Rowan says softly. "He's still in the lighthouse." Malcolm's hands tighten around his mug. "Then it's true," he mutters. "He's always been there, or so the rumors say." That man was the doctor's right-hand helper. He was young back then, might have been in his 20s or 30s. Rowan swallows hard. But why? Why stay in an abandoned lighthouse all these years? Malcolm sighs, his eyes distant. "I suspect guilt ate at him. Maybe he never had the nerve to leave or face the truth. Folks here wanted to bury the past. Nobody wanted a scandal or people poking around. We were a proud fishing community, and if word spread about what might have happened, it could destroy everything." Rowan's chest tightens with anger. But children vanished. Doesn't that matter more than reputation? Malcolm regards him sadly. "You're right, boy. But fear is a powerful thing. People shut their eyes to keep their world from crumbling." Rowan can't argue with that, but he feels a rising determination. He thanks Malcolm for talking with him, then hurries back home, formulating a plan. He needs proof, documents, testimonies, anything to show that these disappearances weren't just rumors. If he can gather enough evidence, maybe an outside authority would listen. That night, a turn of fate places an opportunity directly in Rowan's path. Aunt Mabel has asked him to buy some tea from the general store before it closes. The walk back takes him near the cliff road. The moon is bright, and the wind has calmed, making the path easier to traverse. With a racing heart, Rowan decides to detour. He reaches the lighthouse just as he sees Alden's silhouette pass by a window. Pressing himself against the stone wall, Rowan listens. A muffled humming resonates from within. After a moment, he notices a side entrance, smaller than the main door. Its paint is peeling, and it's slightly ajar. He wonders if Alden forgot to lock it. Summoning his courage, Rowan slips inside. He finds himself in a narrow passage that opens into the main room, where Alden usually keeps his lantern. The man must be upstairs because Rowan hears faint footsteps above. He glances around and spies the table with the old documents. This is his chance. Heart pounding, he quietly crosses the floor, stepping over debris and avoiding rotten planks. At the table, he sees piles of letters and folders with yellowed papers. He begins scanning them, searching for anything referencing the clinic or the doctor. To his horror, he finds medical charts for children, listing symptoms like chronic coughs or fragile immune systems. Some charts have deceased scrawled in red ink, others mention transferred, though no location is provided. A few have cryptic notes about experimental brine therapies. He flips through them, feeling his stomach churn. This wasn't just some eccentric rural doctor. It feels systematic, methodical. Then he stumbles upon a folder with his aunt's surname. Inside, there's a single photograph showing Aunt Mabel's daughter, pale and weak, and 4-line taped to her arm. The doctor's signature is at the bottom of a note that reads, "Advanced testing recommended." Rowan's throat tightens. This is tangible proof that Aunt Mabel's child was involved with the doctor's methods, though the details remain murky. He snaps a few pictures with his phone, though the battery is low and the lighting is poor. His hands tremble, and he nearly drops the device. Just then, he hears a sudden creak on the stairs behind him. He whirls to see Alden, face contorted in alarm. "Put those down," Alden says, voice shaking. "You have no idea." Rowan's fear flares into anger. "How could you let children be treated like this? These charts, your doctor was hurting them, wasn't he?" Alden exhales unsteadily. He steps closer and Rowan feels cornered. The man's hands clench at his sides. "I was an orderly," Alden says, his voice cracking. "I was told these treatments could save sick children. We were just trying to heal them." "Then why did so many disappear?" Rowan demands. Alden's eyes shine with tears. "Because we were too late to stop him. By the time I realized what he was doing was twisted, children had already died. It wasn't about healing them anymore. It was about pushing boundaries, about the doctor's obsession with tapping the sea's properties. He believed it could regenerate lungs, cure incurable illnesses. He tried different chemicals derived from the brine, forced the children to inhale them, submerge in special baths. Some improved briefly, but most, he can't finish the sentence. "I'm sorry. I should have turned him in, but I was scared. He threatened me, threatened the families. Then he fled and I stayed behind, hoping to atone somehow." Rowan's hands tremble. Atone by hiding these documents? By letting the village forget what happened? "I keep the light going at night," Alden says, "because it's the only way I can honor their memory, to remind me of the children who died. And also to warn others away." The village, they conspired in silence. They were terrified of losing everything if outsiders found out. Some officials were bribed or convinced. The families of the children were told half-truths, that their kids needed advanced treatment in bigger hospitals. But those kids never arrived anywhere. Rowan's vision blurs with tears. "My aunt lost her daughter," he whispers. "Did she die here?" Alden closes his eyes, pained. "I don't know about every single case. Some died, some vanished under suspicious circumstances. The doctor kept records, but he also destroyed or altered many." A wave of fury and sorrow overwhelms Rowan. He clutches the documents he's gathered. The village has to know. "We can't keep this secret anymore." Alden's eyes fill with desperation. You'll be going up against powerful elders who kept this hidden for decades. They can do it again. They'll intimidate your aunt, your uncle, anyone who stands in their way. I don't care, Rowan snaps. I'll show them what happened. Alden steps aside as Rowan storms past him, clutching the files. Outside, the night air feels like a slap in the face. His lungs ache and he gasps for breath, but he forces himself to hurry back to the cottage. Clouds obscure the moon, casting the cliffs in a foreboding darkness. At one point, he nearly slips and falls, but manages to catch himself on a rock. When he finally bursts into the cottage, Aunt Mabel and Uncle Albert jump to their feet, alarmed by his disheveled state. I have proof, Rowan says, trembling as he sets the files on the kitchen table. He frantically explains everything: Alden, the doctor's experiments, the missing children, and Aunt Mabel's own daughter's file. Aunt Mabel's hand flies to her mouth. She looks at the photograph of her daughter with fresh tears in her eyes, then she reads the notes scrawled on the page. Uncle Albert grips the back of a chair, knuckles whitening. How could this have stayed hidden all these years? Uncle Albert mutters. Who else is involved? Aunt Mabel sinks into a chair. We tried to question it long ago, but we were lied to at every turn. The blame kept shifting, and we had so little energy after her death. She shuts her eyes, voice quivering. They said we'd never prove anything, that our grief was making us imagine foul play. Rowan's anger flares again. Then we need to make sure this doesn't stay buried. However, the next morning, word seems to have spread that Rowan poked around in the lighthouse. The atmosphere in the village shifts from guarded politeness to active hostility. Harriet at the general store avoids speaking to Rowan. When Aunt Mabel asks for her usual items, Harriet pretends not to hear, shuffling into the back. At the fish stalls, the fishermen suddenly have no extra catch to sell, leaving Aunt Mabel to return home empty-handed. Neighbors who once nodded a greeting now avert their eyes or close their doors. Rowan overhears snippets of conversations. That boy is stirring up trouble, one older woman whispers. He'll bring all sorts of outsiders poking around, a man mutters. Clearly, the village's old guard is mobilizing against any attempt to bring the truth to light. Aunt Mabel stands firm, though fear is etched on her features. She has the file that references her daughter, and she refuses to surrender it. Uncle Albert quietly checks the locks on their windows and doors, worried that someone might try to break in. One night, as a fierce storm looms, with the wind already whipping through the village, Aunt Mabel confides that the mayor, a venerable figure in his 80s, paid her a visit. He told me we should drop this nonsense if we know what's good for us, she says, voice shaking. He implied we'd face trouble otherwise. Rowan feels a surge of protective fury. We should call the authorities, he insists. Real authorities from the neighboring region. If the local ones are compromised, we have to go beyond them. Aunt Mabel rubs her temples. We tried once, long ago, she says. But maybe now we have more to show them. She picks up the phone, but the line is static. A battered old landline is all they have out here, and service is spotty in good weather, let alone during a storm. Determined, Rowan tries his cell phone, but there's no signal. Uncle Albert curses under his breath, complaining that the storm must be knocking out the tower. They have no choice but to wait. Meanwhile, Rowan has an unexpected visitor, Alden. He appears at the cottage door one evening, hunched against the driving rain, hat dripping. Aunt Mabel and Uncle Albert startle at his arrival, but he lifts his hands in a gesture of peace. I came to warn you, he says, voice barely audible over the howling wind. They plan to tear down the lighthouse tonight. The old guard, the council, they know you have proof now. They want to bury the evidence, literally. Aunt Mabel's eyes widen. How? There's a contractor in town, and they plan to use the storm as cover, Alden explains. Claim the structure collapsed. But they'll do what they can to ensure it does. That includes destroying everything inside. Rowan feels a spike of panic. He thinks of the hidden rooms Alden mentioned, the possibility of more comprehensive evidence. If that's destroyed, we'll never prove anything. Alden nods, his face racked with guilt. But I can help you get to the archives in the cellar. If you can gather more records, diaries, or personal items, it might be enough. But we have to go tonight. Despite her fear, Aunt Mabel is resolute. We can't let them destroy the truth, she says. She clutches Rowan's hand. We'll go. But carefully. Uncle Albert hesitates, anxiety clear in his eyes, but he nods grimly. All right, let's do this, he says. I'll drive us to the base of the cliff. The road is dangerous in the storm, but we'll do our best. They prepare by gathering flashlights, rope, and a sturdy bag for documents. The wind howls as they load themselves into Uncle Albert's old truck, which sputters to life with a groan. Alden climbs into the back seat, silent as a statue. Rain lashes the windshield, and thunder growls in the distance. The drive is harrowing. The truck's tires slip on the muddy road, and at one point, a fallen tree branch nearly blocks their path. Uncle Albert maneuvers around it with clenched teeth. The headlights reveal swirling sheets of rain, turning the world outside into a pale blur. Eventually, they reach the foot of the cliff path. The lighthouse looms above them like a dark tower, battered by the storm. They trudge up the slope, fighting the wind with every step. Lightning flashes, illuminating the ocean's furious waves crashing against the rocks below. Rowan clings to Aunt Mabel's hand. Each gust threatens to knock him off his feet. Alden leads the way, brandishing a small flashlight, its beam flickering in the wind-driven rain. When they reach the lighthouse, the main door is ajar, rattling on its hinges. Inside, the storm's fury is somewhat muffled, but the air is freezing, and water drips from multiple cracks in the walls. Alden shines his light around. This way, he says, guiding them to a locked door near the base of the spiral staircase. He fumbles with a ring of keys, finally unlocking a heavy padlock. The door groans open, revealing steps descending into a cellar. A wave of damp, stagnant air rises to meet them. Rowan coughs, covering his mouth with his sleeve. They descend carefully, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The cellar is larger than Rowan expected. Long rows of cots line the walls, rusted metal frames with mildewed mattresses. 4 stands lie toppled in corners, metal trays scattered about. The remains of a makeshift infirmary. Aunt Mabel's breath catches. "Oh my God," she murmurs. "So it's all true." Rowan sees shelves piled with folders, jars of unknown substances, and half-broken medical instruments. Water drips from overhead, forming small puddles on the cracked concrete floor. Uncle Albert moves to one of the shelves, lifting a folder labeled Clinic Trials. He opens it, and they all see neat typed paragraphs detailing brine treatment schedules, oxygen saturation experiments, and other medical jargon. Many entries end with the word expired or transferred. Rowan shines his light on a corner of the room where more personal items lie. Small shoes, children's drawings, dolls, and teddy bears. Tears blur his vision as he realizes these belonged to the young patients. Patients who never left. Alden stands near the staircase, peering upward nervously. "We need to hurry," he urges. "If they bring the building down, we'll be buried alive." They begin collecting any files they can find, stuffing them into waterproof bags Aunt Mabel brought. Lightning flashes outside, and thunder rattles the floor. The entire lighthouse seems to groan in protest at the storm's onslaught. Rowan moves deeper into the cellar, shining his flashlight on a heavy desk. The drawers are locked. He tries yanking them, but they won't budge. He calls for Alden, who rushes over with a small crowbar from the corridor. With a crack of splintering wood, Alden pries the drawers open. Inside are journals, presumably the doctor's personal diaries. Rowan's hands shake as he flips through the first pages, seeing references to children number 14 and #15, each entry detailing bizarre treatments. He feels sick reading it, but he knows these diaries are vital evidence. He stuffs them into the bag. Suddenly, footsteps echo from above, accompanied by angry voices. Alden stiffens. "They're here," he whispers, eyes widening. Aunt Mabel and Uncle Albert exchange worried glances. Rowan's pulse pounds in his ears. They hear a muffled shout. "We need to bring down the central support column. That'll collapse the staircase. Hurry before anyone sees." Rowan's eyes dart around, searching for another way out. The cellar walls are thick stone. The only staircase leads to the main floor. Alden curses under his breath. "We might have to confront them," he says grimly. But Aunt Mabel shakes her head. "They could overpower us. If they see we have the files, they'll try to destroy them. Or worse." Uncle Albert's jaw sets. "I can create a distraction. Mabel, you take Rowan and the documents, try to slip out a window if there is one." Alden points to a narrow corridor. There's a tiny ventilation shaft at the end. It was used to bring in fresh air for the old generator. "It's small and rusted, but maybe we can force it open." They race down the corridor, their flashlights dancing on the walls. The shouting above intensifies, followed by a heavy crash that shakes dust loose from the ceiling. Lightning strikes so close that a flash of blinding light momentarily illuminates the corridor. The wind roars, and water seeps through cracks in the stone. At the end of the passage, they find a metal grate set high in the wall, partially corroded by salt. Alden pushes a crate beneath it, then climbs up to pry at the grate with his crowbar. The metal screeches, but it doesn't give way easily. Uncle Albert grips Rowan's arm. "You go first once it's open," he instructs. Another impact shakes the building. Bits of plaster rain down on them. They can hear men shouting above, "Keep going. It's almost done." The sense of impending collapse intensifies. Finally, Alden manages to bend the grate. With a grunt, he pulls it loose, revealing a narrow tunnel to the outside. Rowan shoves the bag of documents through first, then scrambles up onto the crate. He squeezes into the opening, the rusted edges scraping his shoulders. Rain blasts him from outside as he wriggles forward. He's momentarily stuck at the waist, panic surging, but Aunt Mabel pushes from behind, and he slides free, landing in a tangle of wet grass outside. He helps haul the bag out, then sees Aunt Mabel's hands reaching through. She emerges next, with Uncle Albert close behind. Alden hesitates in the opening. The building shudders again, a wooden beam crashing somewhere behind him. He starts to pull himself out, but a piece of debris from the collapsing corridor hits him. He cries out, arms flailing. Rowan grabs his wrist. Uncle Albert grasps Alden's other arm, straining to pull him through the opening. With a last burst of effort, Alden tumbles onto the wet ground, coughing. But they're not safe yet. The edge of the lighthouse above them is cracking, large stones loosened by the storm. The entire structure might slide down the cliff. Grimly, they scramble away, each step treacherous on the muddy slope. Above them, a small group of older villagers, led by the mayor, stand near the main door. One of them sees Rowan's group and shouts, "They've got the records." Another man wields a crowbar, as if he's ready to chase them down. Lightning tears across the sky, revealing the mayor's furious face. "This ends tonight. We won't let you ruin everything we've built," he screams. But the words barely carry over the roar of the wind and waves. Rowan's heart thunders. He clutches the bag tightly, clinging to Aunt Mabel's arm. Alden, limping slightly, tries to hurry them along. They slip behind a cluster of boulders near the cliff edge, seeking cover from the jagged hail of debris as the lighthouse's top sways ominously. Another bolt of lightning strikes the far side of the structure, sending a massive chunk of masonry tumbling down the rocky slope. The ground beneath their feet trembles. The mayor and his cohorts, seeing the danger, start to retreat. One of them notices that Rowan's group is pinned between the collapsing lighthouse and the storm-lashed cliff. There's a moment of tension, as if they might actually try to wrest the documents away by force. But the ground shakes again, and the men sprint off, driven by fear for their own lives. Fighting the gale, Rowan, Aunt Mabel, Uncle Albert, and Alden inch along the cliffside, hooking their arms around each other for stability. Finally, they reach a more stable path. In the distance, they hear the lighthouse give one final groan before part of its upper section tears away, crashing onto the rocks below in a spray of stone and foam. The lens room, once the heart of the lighthouse, shatters, and the once proud tower stands partially collapsed, the top sheared off by the storm's wrath. They trudge back to the truck, soaking wet and shaking. Alden is bleeding from a gash on his arm, and Aunt Mabel uses a piece of cloth to stem the flow. Rowan's chest feels tight from exertion, but relief floods him at the sight of the bag, still clutched in Uncle Albert's arms, safe and intact. By dawn, the storm has diminished to a steady rain. The roads are slick and strewn with fallen branches. They manage to drive to the next town over, where the phone lines and cell signals are more reliable. From a small cafe with a payphone, Aunt Mabel calls an investigator from the regional authority, explaining the situation. Rowan anxiously clutches the documents at a table in the corner, scanning the diaries, photos, and medical charts once more, verifying they're not damaged beyond use. Alden sits across from him, looking utterly spent. "I'll give my testimony," Alden says quietly, voice raw. "I've stayed silent too long. If it means those children can finally be acknowledged and laid to rest, I'm ready." Rowan nods, tears gathering in his eyes. "Thank you," he says, "for helping us." Alden manages a wan smile, though regret shadows his gaze. "I should have done this years ago." Authorities arrive by mid-morning, men and women in dark windbreakers, accompanied by local law enforcement from outside the village. They interview everyone, taking possession of the documents, photographing each page for evidence. Aunt Mabel shows them the file about her daughter. "We never had a death certificate," she says, voice trembling. "We were told it was pneumonia that took her, but these records, they suggest they were experimenting on her." An investigator, a middle-aged woman with empathetic eyes, puts a reassuring hand on Aunt Mabel's shoulder. "We'll get to the bottom of this," she promises. Over the following days and weeks, an official investigation is launched. News outlets catch wind of the story: an abandoned lighthouse, missing children, a decades-old conspiracy. Camera crews come, filming the half-collapsed tower. Reporters manage to find some of the old guard who tried to hide everything, and they film them for local broadcasts, shining a harsh light on the lengths these elders went to in order to maintain the village's reputation. Word spreads to families across the region who once sent their children to the clinic. Grief resurfaces as they learn the horrifying truth, but also a measure of closure emerges as they discover what likely happened. The authorities arrest a few of the elderly council members who orchestrated the cover-up. The mayor is forced to resign in disgrace, indicted on charges related to obstruction of justice and conspiracy. During this tumultuous period, Rowan stays with Aunt Mabel and Uncle Albert, traveling with them for official hearings in the neighboring town. Despite the endless questions and media attention, Rowan's health surprisingly holds steady, his lungs seeming to benefit from the bracing sea air. Ironic, given the horrors once inflicted in the name of that same sea air. Through it all, Alden provides a statement, describing how he joined the doctor as a naive assistant, seduced by promises of innovative cures. "I believed we were on the cusp of a breakthrough," he recounts, voice shaking in a small courtroom where the preliminary hearings take place. "Then the doctor's methods grew darker, more desperate. I wanted to speak up, but he threatened me, said I'd be implicated in the children's deaths if I went to the authorities. When he fled, I thought staying in the lighthouse might keep me close to their spirits. I tried to keep the memory alive by never letting the beacon go dark." His confession brings some villagers to tears. Even those who scorned him realize how tormented he's been. Over time, Aunt Mabel and Uncle Albert come to forgive him, though it's a slow, painful process. They see the toll regret has taken on him. In the aftermath, there's a poignant memorial service for the children. The villagers who once turned a blind eye gather in the small church to light candles and speak the names of those who never came home. Paper lanterns are set afloat on the sea one calm evening, bobbing on the moonlit waves. Malcolm, The old man from the porch stands near Rowan, tears glistening on his weathered cheeks. "Never thought I'd see the day we faced the truth," he murmurs. Rowan, holding a lantern of his own, feels a swirling mix of sadness and resolve. He thinks of the photograph of all those children, once hopeful, now memorialized. He releases his lantern onto the water, watching it drift, carrying silent prayers. The summer draws to a close, and Rowan's parents arrange for him to return home. His final days in the village are oddly serene. Though the scandal is still fresh, there's a weight lifted from the atmosphere. Gone is the facade of forced cheerfulness. Instead, there's honesty, and with honesty comes a kind of healing. Some villagers even thank Rowan for uncovering the truth. Others remain distant, clearly wishing none of this had ever come to light, but they no longer ignore or threaten him. A few weeks later, Rowan stands on the dock where he first arrived, a small suitcase by his side. Aunt Mabel and Uncle Albert linger with him, quiet but visibly emotional. They both hug him, Aunt Mabel pressing a small envelope into his hand. "Letters," she says. "We want to keep in touch. And, if you ever need to talk about what happened, we're here." Rowan's eyes sting with tears. "I'll call every week," he promises. "And right, I'll miss you." He boards the same rickety bus that led him here, noticing how different he feels now compared to that first day. He's grown stronger, physically and emotionally. He takes a seat by the window, gazing back at the shoreline as the bus starts up. The lighthouse, half ruined, still stands on the cliff, a silent testament to both horror and truth. A sense of closure washes over him. Alden is not at the dock to say goodbye. Rowan knows he's recovering in the care of neighbors who have come around to supporting him, at least in a small way. Maybe in time, Alden will find a measure of peace or forgiveness from himself. For now, his role in unearthing the secret is done. The bus rumbles away, taking Rowan toward the next town, where eventually he'll return to his parents. As he leans his head against the glass, he imagines the dark corridors of the lighthouse, the diaries and cots, the children's shoes and drawings left behind. Despite the tragedy, Rowan feels something like hope in his chest because the truth is finally out. There may be no perfect justice for the lives lost, but at least their memories are free from the shadows. He closes his eyes, letting the steady hum of the engine lull him into a quiet reflection. The following year, Rowan writes letters to Aunt Mabel, learning that an official monument is planned where the lighthouse once stood. Enough of the base remains to serve as a historical marker. Volunteers have helped salvage what they can from the cellar, preserving it in a small museum that the regional authorities set up to document the tragedy. Tourists will come, read the plaques, see the photographs, and understand that a small coastal village once tried to hide a dark secret, but was ultimately forced to confront it. Aunt Mabel shares that she's found a new calm in being able to finally grieve her daughter properly. She and Uncle Albert place a memorial plaque in the church, acknowledging that their child was lost under mysterious medical circumstances, no longer burying the truth. The sadness remains, but it's no longer bound by silence and guilt. Rowan's parents tell him he seems more confident, more mature since his stay in the village. He doesn't detail everything, it's too complicated, but he does share that he discovered the importance of speaking up, even when others want to keep things quiet. One evening, Rowan sits in his city bedroom, gazing out at the skyline. He's been coughing less, and his doctors are optimistic about his lungs. The old photograph from the lighthouse rests in a small frame on his desk, reminding him of the children whose stories he helped reveal. He's no longer just a fragile boy. He's someone who stood against a town's collective denial and brought truth to light. His thoughts drift back to the final image he carries with him, the battered lighthouse after the storm, overshadowed by rain clouds yet still standing, battered but not erased. That enduring silhouette is, for Rowan, a symbol of perseverance. Secrets can be buried by time, denial, and fear, but with determination, they can be unearthed, and wrongs can be confronted, even if the scars remain. He presses a hand to his chest, breathes deeply, and closes his eyes, recalling the roar of the ocean and the flicker of lantern light in Alden's weathered face. There's pain in the memory, but also a glimmer of something pure and strong, the conviction that even one voice can break through decades of silence. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.